Good morning, everybody. This is the Legal and Justice System Committee meeting, and we are starting. It's 11:30. We're going a little bit out of order because Mike Parker's not going to join us until noon. Some of you may have heard his presentation already at maybe one of the other meetings or at the last task force meeting. But it's going to be up for a vote if that's something that everybody wants to go with, the GARE toolkit for racial equity, or if we want to do something else, or if somebody has a better toolkit that they would like. So I wanted to make sure everybody on this committee had a chance to hear it, review it, and ask any questions prior to the next task force meeting, because I don't know if everybody had the chance to review that. So that'll be coming up at noon. And then the re-entry, Jackie gave us some information on it at the last meeting, and so we were going to touch base. So I think we can start with re-entry. And does anybody want to start that out for me? Jackie, do you have any updates on the MCO contracts and re-entry and where we're at?
Jackie, your phone may be muted. We can't hear you.
Are we getting Jackie? I heard her earlier.
She's logged on, so.
Yeah, sorry. Dan wanted me to forward the appointment, so my computer got sort of bogged down while I was doing that. So she may be joining us here. Yes, I just, hopefully everybody had time to look at the outline. I didn't want to add too much, except that we probably will need to do that number one there with the MCOs, which is form a data sharing agreement with them. And the rest of it, transitional care coordination, etc., we already work with them. I mean, that's part of what we do as part of healthcare and behavioral healthcare in general. So working with the MCOs on that, I guess I should step back a bit and just say, you recall at the last meeting I talked about how the MCOs did not want to play ball with us, and they signed a partial FTE for reentry. And they left us with saying that they were being asked to do everything under the sun in regard to this contract with the healthcare authority. And we can't really figure out why they're saying that, because this looks like just business as usual to us in terms of care coordination. They do have metrics that they have to come up with, which are basically healthcare metrics. They're not really community-based metrics. They're not very community-centric. They're not metrics that are necessarily in line with the incarceration prevention task force's metrics. And so, you know, like I was saying, they're not community oriented. They're more business oriented. The MCOs are. And so we just are kind of confused about why they think they're being asked to do so much, and yet they have plans to keep their staff in, you know, Tacoma and Olympia, and maybe come up once a month or twice a month to show up at the jail and help cover the people that are on their plans. So they would end up seeing very few people, helping very few people out the door in their reentry programs. It just doesn't make sense. So for them to bow out of funding a part of a reentry position, which would have cost them pennies on the dollar, just which would have been much more efficient than what they're planning to do, just didn't make any sense to us. So we don't really understand what they're doing. So that's basically what I wanted to say. That I wasn't going to go over this responsibilities in any great detail because it's just pretty much care coordination responsibilities, and it's the stuff that we do now as part of re-entry in the jail. Yes, Arlene.
Do you need anything from us on this? Because to me, this has to do with money and power. And they're in the power position and we have certain powers and the state gives them this job, the totality of this job. So would it be helpful if we form, some sort of communication to the MCOs?
Yes, I think that this should go back to maybe the larger task force.
Okay.
And as a discussion perhaps of what could be done in terms of follow-up. Maybe, I'm not sure what, a letter questioning the value of having people trying to conduct reentry from so far away and so inefficient in such an inefficient manner when we already have reentry staff to do that work locally. I mean, and the other thing is they couldn't possibly know the resources in this area, right? I mean, each community has resources, and how could you, as an MCO operating from Tacoma, know what the resources are in Whatcom County? How could you know that? You just couldn't. So
what they're offering is completely unacceptable.
yeah, I think so.
And so that has to be expressed and we have to make it clear what we need. And what we need is certainly the most minimal thing we need is what we've already had. But that, of course, we know from all of the reports given to us by the representatives that those are not quite adequate either. So, I mean, to me, this is an absolutely crucial piece of what we're trying to do here.
Ann Deacon and then Stephen Gockley have their hands raised.
Go ahead, Ann.
Thank you. I think we as a task force really need to figure out how we want to address these funding issues for operational programs with the state healthcare authority and maybe even the governor's office. So we are having the same discussions, of course, with the crisis stabilization facility. It is critical for our priorities in this community to have the ability for an involuntary placement at our new Triage Crisis Stabilization Center with a peace officer hold. It's critical for us as a priority in our community to have robust reentry services so that people have a chance to stabilize and get better. And those are not the types of performance measures that are priorities for the MCOs simply because it's not the performance metrics they're graded by from the healthcare authority. So I think we can bring forth to the larger committee some ideas about how to address it. And we're also working with this, with the regional Behavioral Health Administrative Services organization on how we might address this as well. But we, the MCOs are not beholden to the counties. And so they are not particularly interested in what we want or what we prioritize. They're interested in what they need to address relative to the performance metrics required in their contracts with the state. So I think we need to figure out where the leverage points are and the influence and go forward. And we can bring forth some recommendations about that.
So do you mean that we is your department?
Yes. Since we're the ones who hold the contracts and the obligation for services or tenants at both the jail as well as the Crisis Stabilization Center.
Do you need any help from us or support from us?
I think we will, and we will provide you with some ideas about what kind of support we think would be helpful.
Okay, I think we had Stephen Gockley, and it looks like Darlene Peterson.
First is just a question for understanding. Are we looking at the actual language from the contract lifted out? Or is this a summary?
Well,
I don't know.
it is a summary, but it's using the same language they had in the contract.
So and I'm assuming that item number 4 is where we're looking at for that information. Is there anything missing from that? I mean, I guess we don't have any opportunity to change what the demands are on the MCOs.
No, I don't do. This is their contract, basically, yeah.
Okay, I guess I'll move on then to ask for a little better understanding of whether we've talked to anybody besides the MCOs and what the consensus is from other counties and whether we have any allies in the governor's office.
We spoke, so there is a state association of county human services. So the Whatcom County belongs to that association, and our human services department is actively involved. I co-chair the behavioral health committee of that organization. And at our last meeting in September, we had the Healthcare Authority visit us and we talked about some of these issues. They were not aware of the issues. I think the Healthcare Authority also has a hard time understanding what counties do. They really operate from a health insurance perspective, covered lives perspective, as opposed to community-based health or health systems. So I think they were surprised to hear some of it. We are continuing to work with the Healthcare Authority through that association, which is probably our largest voice. But I do think it made a difference when the governor visited us last year, I believe, and we talked with him about the operational concerns and some of the oversights in this integrated managed care model that the state missed, which is basically that counties drive and support and create systems of coordinated care, whether it's through EMS, through law enforcement, through human services, through housing programs, through behavioral health programs. I mean, there's so much we do at a county level to create these systems with all the different stakeholders. And that's not how the Healthcare Authority thinks. I think it was just, it's almost like a foreign language. And so we've worked with them a lot over the last few years to try to help them understand this. But I also think they've been pressured to get these services out in their new integrated managed care system and therefore overlooked things. When we brought it up to the governor, he did go back and he did put in an additional, at that point, $6 million of state general fund into the budget, the current year's budget, to address some of the gaps in services for people who are not covered by Medicaid. Not that it was enough, but it did help us and it did help our Crisis Stabilization Center. So there's efforts underway, but we are a small voice, and I think we're also now working with the Washington State Association of Counties, which is an affiliate of the Association of County Human Services on this effort as well, but it's really at the very beginning stages. There's a special behavioral health committee that has been set up, and it's mostly county commissioners, county council members that are part of it, who also, of course, don't do this work on a daily basis, so do need a lot of support in terms of knowing where the points of discussion have to occur.
So I just want to say I blinked out for a minute, and I'm worried that Stephen Blockley just got blinked out too, because the electricity might be in and out of different places due to the wind.
Yes, and I also wanted to say that it's flickering here in the courthouse. So if the courthouse people suddenly leave the meeting, you'll know why. Yeah.
It's nothing we said.
I think we also had Darlene's hand raised, and I'm hoping that everybody keeps their power on.
Good morning. Yeah, ours is blinked off once already too. I ask that you forgive me for my ignorance. I missed the last meeting. I'm trying to understand what the importance is and what this is for. I know that we have local people who help when people are leaving jail. Can you just give a real quick thumbnail about why we need this or how this got started?
So we have a jail behavioral health program team in the jail, and for quite some time, part of that team has been a part-time re-entry person who helps people going out the door who have serious mental illnesses get connected with services, and sometimes people with substance use disorders, when there's time on the caseload, get connected with services. And so Wendy Jones and Ann and myself had meetings recently with the managed care organizations, probably about 3 months ago, to discuss the issue of them funding another part-time of that reentry position. And we probably had, well, maybe we just had one meeting and then several emails. And then we came up with a number, a figure for them to fund for that part-time salaried position, and they declined to support it. So that's the basic background.
And Darlene, just to remind you and others, I know this gets into the weeds a lot, but the managed care organizations are obligated to cover all healthcare costs, to include behavioral health care costs for their Medicaid covered lives. And part of their contract with the State Healthcare Authority is to provide these services. It's just that they were going to provide them remotely, which of course inmates don't have phones with them while they're incarcerated. So that of course is a barrier. And then I think they were asking for the county jail staff to do their work on their behalf for no reimbursement, like telling them who of their covered lives are currently booked into the jail, which we said, happy to do that. That will cost you. You know, if we're using staff time to do your work, then we will charge you, and they don't want to pay.
And this person's job consists of meeting with people up to 30 days in advance if possible, and conducting a needs assessment as to what they need when they go out of the jail, when they're released, and then setting up an individual service plan as they go out the door, and then connecting them with the services that they need going out the door, and then following them for up to 90 days so that they get connected with the services they need.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
Any other questions or comments on this topic from anybody else?
Raylene, this is Stephen. I just want to apologize. The wind knocked out our power and disconnected my Wi-Fi. So if I looked dead to the world there for a while, that was what went on. And I'm sorry. I know I was in the middle of Ann and Jackie explaining things. I'll catch up later.
Stephen, if it's possible, could you turn up your volume a little bit?
Thank you. This is Maya. I was going to say the same. I didn't know if it was me, technology, but I can barely hear. Thank you.
I'm sorry. It's turned up as much as it is. I'll just speak louder. Is that any better?
Oh, I'm talking and I'm muted. If you can just yell at us, Stephen, that would be awesome. Thank you. And I didn't see any other hands raised. And I really appreciate both you and Jackie's input on this. And I do think it's very important that we address this. Maybe this could be something that would be also on the topic for the joint meeting. If there's anything that we can do that we can bring toward the task force, if we can look at the state funding and say, hey, you guys are funded by the state, we're part of the state, and we want to make sure that we're getting what we need adequately. I know prior meetings, we've talked about getting a navigator. I know that budgets are very tight across the state right now, and I think trying to get a piece of any pie is going to be very difficult, but we could look into maybe trying to figure out if there's any funding for the navigator to assist in this program. But anything else that you think we could assist in trying to get a letter or get the task force involved to make sure that we have our needs met here in Whatcom County would be greatly appreciated. So thank you. And then the next topic, it looks like we've got Jackie Mitchell again on update on the status of the involuntary holds at the crisis center.
Anne, oh, I didn't notice that I was supposed to do that. I wonder if Anne, if you could take that one, please.
Sure. We put out an RFP, a request for proposals for the current tenants of this new building and let them know that one of our requirements was the ability to provide involuntary placement for the mental health side of the house. Currently, that's not in play for the substance use withdrawal management side of the house because that's a whole nother different set of laws, and we aren't we have not been chosen by the state to do that service here in our neck of the woods yet. But we do have the ability to provide a higher level of care at the triage side of the house, which would require that involuntary hold by a peace officer for up to 12 hours. And it could be used as a diversion from arrest and incarceration, not to mention diversion from the hospital. And we are working with Compass Health, who is the provider of those mental health services. They have provided the budget for staffing in order to provide that level of service to the MCOs. They are still currently in talks with the MCOs about this process. They do not have final word back. I think the concern for them was if the MCOs aren't going to pay them to cover the staff they believe is needed to provide this level of service, then they may need to do voluntary triage rather than involuntary. Obviously, that is not our goal. That is not our wish. And we, again, not to repeat the last conversation, but it's very similar in that we are working very hard to make sure two things. One, that the MCOs pay for a 24/7 facility, meaning just like a fire station or the police department that you pay to keep it running 24/7, not just when somebody happens to show up for services. And then secondly, to work very closely with Compass Health and our law enforcement agencies to truly, to the greatest extent possible, identify the profile of the people that they intend or believe they would be diverting to this facility, so that Compass also has a better sense of truly what kind of staffing is needed. We do not want law enforcement to bring people here who are physically aggressive or need physical management. Obviously, that does not help support or promote a therapeutic milieu. But we do know that some people, when they arrive, may not want to stay. And so you want law enforcement's hold to give them a little bit of extra encouragement to stay. They'll have a room of their own, 3 meals a day, availability for snacks. while hopefully staff then have a chance to work with them on next steps. So I just think we have two main areas of activity. One is the rate negotiations with the MCOs, and the second is to make sure that we can truly identify the kinds of folks that we think would best benefit from this service.
So my question, Anne, is what can we do to help with that process? You talked about some type of a inventory or survey or some type of I don't know, profile of individuals that we would best bring there and what that need would be. Because I think that our ability to do involuntary commitments is going to be critical and much appreciated. So how can I help?
So we formed a Crisis Stabilization Center Program Advisory Committee, separate from the kind of the construction and general program subcommittee of the task force here. And our next step, and I was waiting to schedule the next meeting for that, our next step is to find out what kind of rates are being offered to Compass Health. And then from there, I think we will probably hold a few sessions with law enforcement agencies and Compass Health to begin to identify the population, so there is mutual understanding and that Compass Health knows that they can manage these people effectively and safely within the staffing model they end up with. I do believe we can get to an involuntary status even if they don't get fully funded at the level they want from the MCOs. But I also don't want to give up on the effort that the MCO should pay what it costs to keep their people out of jail and out of the hospital.
Okay, so what I'm hearing from you also is that it would be, I think, appreciated if we were able to identify people who are non-combative and physical that would fit that profile. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's right. It's a 16-bed unit, and even though it's certainly much larger than what we have now, much, much larger, if staff are always physically managing people and having to put them into seclusion or restraints, it doesn't benefit anyone else on the unit, right? So it is a balance, but that's not to say that sometimes somebody might need some seclusion. They may need just, quote, a timeout. And the hope is that we could still offer that, obviously. And we have rooms to offer them that timeout. But they also have their own private room, so they could also just go into their own bedroom and cool down.
And would that discussion center both on the involuntary holds that are authorized under 10.31 as well as people who are in grave danger of themselves or others under the other statute that I can't recall?
Yeah, 7105 is the other statute. Great question. So the triage with involuntary placement is an RCW, a Regulatory Code of Washington statute that is only the peace officer hold under that RCW 1031-110. That's what can be held at this facility. But I'm gonna confuse you, and I'm sorry, Bill, but if a DCR, a designated crisis responder, is called to this facility, evaluates somebody who's on a peace officer hold and deems them appropriate to be held under the Involuntary Treatment Act, which is that RCW 7105, this facility actually can hold that person under the 7105 until a location can be found to transfer them to for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Bill. I believe Stephen Gockley has his hand raised. Go ahead, Stephen.
Thank you. Tell me if I'm too quiet again. Just filling a historical gap in my recollection, didn't we get a legislative study group or task force that was supposed to deal with these operational funding issues and work something out for the legislature to enact? And what happened with that?
So there's we worked with Representative Sharon Shoemake to bring this issue forward to the legislature. She was able to get special funding dedicated to Whatcom County only and for the non-Medicaid population. And so that's the extent of the formal process. The only semi-formal process was that we had a Policy Academy grant from the from the MacArthur Foundation, where we did work on this issue somewhat. I've also been in touch with the governor's office about this during that legislative session when we did get the money, and it was news to them that there were issues with this. But there was never been a formal entity that did this work. There is obviously significant activity going on, however. This is what keeps me up at night.
Well, you're not the only one that feels that way. I mean, because I look at what we're trying to do as an enormous puzzle that we have to have all the pieces in place. So the police department and the sheriff's officers can't do their job to the standard that they want unless we have a place to hold people, because this does happen sometimes.
Yeah, I think our community has been crystal clear about our expectations. And we have to find a way to get there. And funding is a large part of it, but it's not all of it.
I'd like to mention that I attended a co-occurring conference this past Monday and Tuesday, and there was a class on what the counties are doing for diversion. And when I mentioned that I am serving on this task force, the man teaching the class started to rave about Whatcom County's program for diversion. And he said that it's a light, a shining light to the whole state. So I was sort of amazed by what he was saying, but at the same time, really pleased. And so I just want us to stay on that track so that we really are that light and that we have everything that we need in place. And it seems to me that maybe we should be contacting the healthcare authority that gives the power to the MCOs with our frustration and disappointment that they're not paying for the services that we need to have.
So we are definitely working on that, and we'll bring something to the joint meeting for discussion, something a little bit more meaty. Can I ask Arlene who the person was who facilitated that session?
I've got it in my notes, but I just don't have my notes right here with me. I just wrote down everything that I learned. It was an incredible co-occurring disorders conference. It was really amazing. And, but that was I was really so glad to see that, to hear what he said. But I can get that information to you.
Thank you, Arlene.
Anne?
Yes.
Can you provide a little more detail on what sort of traction we have with the North Sound Behavioral ASO and whether other regional ASOs are on board with this, and how we might partner with them to leverage some increased influence?
The ASOs are definitely in support of this effort and have found money to help increase the support for the non-Medicaid population. They don't oversee the Medicaid population though. And in fact, they have to contract with the MCOs just to provide the crisis services that are required under law. So there is some difficulty, but I've been working very closely with their executive director to get this discussion at what we call the interlocal leadership structure, which has all 5 MCOs at the table. We're going to bring in the providers of these services. The ASO will be there, the counties will be there. And I hope that happens within the month.
Thank you so much, Anne, for saying that. We really need to hear what you're saying. And immediately following this meeting from 1 to 3 is the North Sound Behavioral Health ASO meeting. And by the way, the topic of this meeting, I'm on that board, is for the MCOs are going to be present to answer questions.
Oh,
so
put them on the spot, Arlene.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how flexible that discussion is going to be for us. People have submitted questions ahead of time, but we'll see. But I just wanted to mention that.
And just a quick question from what you were speaking about earlier. Do we look at this facility as diversion? We're not charging, that there's not criminal charges pending against any of these. It's more of just a stabilization and triage.
Well, it's not a correctional facility, but that doesn't mean that people who might not have charges against them might not be there. But that I would have to defer to the legal people and the law enforcement about how that happens.
Then I think my question is going to be for probably Elfo and David Dull and Eric Ritchie and maybe Deborah Garrett. Question: if we have somebody that's involuntarily committed and there is a crime and there's a victim out there and they stabilize that person, usually if they're in the jail and then they go to the hospital, there's a temporary release order. But when the law enforcement officer brings somebody directly to the hospital and they're stabilized and they're released an hour later or 5 hours later, and there was a victim out there, is there any way to get a no contact order or that person transported to the jail? Or is that person basically just going in for their involuntary hold? We have victims out there and they're being released from the hospital.
I just might say it's my belief the state law changed and enlarged the number of people that are eligible under that 1031 statute. And it doesn't specify, I don't believe, felony or misdemeanor or violent or nonviolent crime. So we're going to have to come up, as the sheriff's office, as I imagine other agencies will do, we'll have to give direction to our officers as to what type of crimes are appropriate for that type of commitment. We certainly wouldn't want to use it for a crime of any kind of significant violence. And in all cases, we're going to have our deputies write reports and refer them to the prosecutor's office so they can ultimately make a charging decision if need be.
I guess what I'm concerned about is that there's a gap. The person gets released, it gets put on the prosecutor's desk, and if that person's held in jail, they've got so much time to be seen by a judge, and it's more of a priority for the prosecutor. Whereas when they're getting all of these cases sent to them for review, and there was definitely a need for them to be put in the hospital, whether it was a fit or something occurred, that then we've got a gap out there and we have concern for the victim. So I guess I'm looking to see if we can do anything about that, or if you guys think that I'm off on that and there's not a missing piece.
No, Raylene, you're not missing anything on that. You're right on point. We've talked about these issues a number of times, and I think that we've addressed them reasonably well. I think that we have a system in place that gets people no contact orders when they have been released to the hospital prior to going in front of court. Bill, maybe you know better about that, but I think that we did put a system into place to make that happen. And I'll tell you what, before Bill speaks, I just want to say that this is something that we addressed probably within the last 6 months, because it's something that did come up and we wanted to take care of.
The answer is yes.
Is there any other questions on this topic? And Bill, if you could share some of that information on how that's done through the county, I'd appreciate it for the small courts.
Yes.
Okay, I think we have Mike Parker on hand now, so I think we can jump to the Racial Equity Toolkit unless anybody has any more questions for Jackie or Ann. All right, Mike, you're up, and Jill, if you can help with the slides if needed, or share the screen with Mike Parker. Thank you.
All right, thank you all for having me here today, and sorry I'm late getting out of another meeting. And I'll see if I can get this going. Can you all see my screen? All right. Okay, I'll go ahead and get started. I apologize if you have heard this. There are probably some people on this webinar today that have already heard this, so I apologize for any redundancies. I want to start out with another apology, is that I'm probably not the most ideal person to be talking about racial equity. I'm a white person. I have a decent amount of privilege, and there may be people in the room, and certainly people in our community, who are more personally affected and might be better messengers. You get me today because I'm willing. I'm passionate about this, and I really think that, especially in this area of county government, but really everywhere, we can start making some tactical, practical changes that don't have to be huge lifts, that help us address racial inequities in our system. So I'll go ahead and begin. The particular organization, by the way, of the Racial Equity Tool, if people are hearing about these, there's a lot in the news. This one is created by the Local and Regional Government Alliance on Racial Equity. It was formed by a couple of nonprofits who are doing this work, but they recognize the need, one, to team up, and two, to create a framework and a format for people doing the work that we're doing, which is the work of government, reforming that and optimizing it. So I think it's uniquely appropriate as opposed to other racial equity tools. So obviously our goal in Incarceration Prevention Reduction Task Force is to reduce incarceration. You all are meeting about it and talking about particular issues today where the solutions help keep people out of that system. From these listening sessions and protests, we know that people want a criminal justice system that keeps us all safe. We want a society where our children are safe and they thrive and prosper. We want a system that's just and equitable for all. We have huge problems in our country in this area. This is not local statistics, but I think they're compelling, and I share them with you. They're from the Prison Policy Initiative, which is a good think tank, and has been studying this. So 64% of the US population are people that look like me. They're white, Caucasian, and yet, I need to move my screen here. They represent 39% of the prison population. African Americans, however, are only 13% of the US population, but they represent 40% of the prison population. So if we weren't galvanized that we have issues, I hope that gets us there. Another thing that was really compelling for me and why I'm bringing this to you is that there's really no such thing as a non-racist policy. I'm in the process of reading this book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. I don't read a lot of nonfiction, but I'll tell you, this is really worth it. So Ibram Kendi writes, there's no such thing as a non-racist or race-neutral policy. Every policy in every institution in every community in every nation is producing or sustaining either racial inequity or equity between racial groups. This was really important for me personally to understand, because when we create a policy that doesn't necessarily is considered, and I'll put in quotations, race neutral, it may be by intent, but we have to go further. We have to look at the outcomes and the results. And I think that's what he's getting at. This group, I believe it's been in existence since when? 2015, so quite a long time. I've only been on this incarceration group for the past couple of years. I am nothing but impressed at the work, the efforts, and the passion and the care. We can continue to lead change in our systems. We can continue to build on the wins that we've done, And we can also be responsive to what the American public, I believe, is calling us to do, which is be a leader in creating a racially equitable justice system, not one that reduces incarceration and gets the right people where they need to be. That's important. But we also need to make sure that we are not having an unintended consequence or a disparate impact. And a racial equity toolkit is simply that. It's a toolkit that can help us move the needle in this area. Why should we adopt it? I won't read both of these to you. I think these slides are available. I'll just read one of these. Too often, policies and programs are developed and implemented without thoughtful consideration of racial equity. When racial equity is not explicitly brought into the operations and decision-making, racial inequities are likely to be perpetuated. That is really key. It's when we don't ask the questions, we can accidentally be making it worse. Racial equity tools provide a structure for institutionalizing the consideration of racial equity. So as I mentioned, this tool that I think Jill put in your packet today, so you should have at least their packet that's available on their website, but the Local Government Alliance on Racial Equity, their tool proactively seeks to eliminate racial inequities, helps communities and task forces such as ours identify clear goals, objectives, and measurable outcomes that we can later benchmark against. It helps us be mindful about who are we engaging in our decision-making process. It also assists us identify who will benefit or who will be burdened by any given decision. And it helps us examine some of those unintended consequences that I was telling you about and develop strategies to advance racial equity and mitigate any unintended negative consequences. I think a great example was a pretrial assessment, right? So this group was looking at pretrial assessments and realizing that that very reform or that implementation had some pieces that actually were going to have unintended racial consequences. And it helps us develop mechanisms for successful implementation and evaluation of that impact. If we can measure our data, we can implement a reform, and then we're going to go back after and we're going to see what happened. What is a racial equity tool? So some of you have seen this a couple of times, so my apologies again. But essentially, it is a simple set of questions. It is a process. It's kind of a way stop in the journey. So these simple questions, and I won't read them all out, but it starts with one, what is your proposal? What are you trying to do? What are your desired results and outcomes? Two, data. In our group, this is going to be the index committee, right? Getting Caleb up and running and getting that information to us. What's the data? What does it tell us? Community engagement. How have communities been engaged? What do our membership look like? Do we have opportunities in a membership of our task force, for example, to increase representation, to do it maybe in a different manner? Number four is analysis and strategies. Who's going to benefit? Who might be hurt? How will this impact? And this can be for very positive things too. And when we talk to your crisis stabilization center group, I think that question comes up. Who benefits? Who's going to use that center? Who's not? Who will be brought there? Who won't? And are there racial differences in that strategy? Implementation, how are you going to implement it? And number six, accountability and communication. This is a really key thing for especially a data-driven group such as this task force. But how do you ensure accountability? How do you communicate about it? And how do you evaluate results to make sure that you did what you were supposed to do and that you didn't unintendedly make something worse for another group? So a racial equity toolkit doesn't fix everything. It is just the beginning. It will help us though shape an equity lens or framework that ensures that the policies, the proposals, the reforms, however you want to term it, that they are as just and equitable as they can be. And when we find out they're not, we retool. It also provides powerful information to move our task force forward in a more inclusive and equitable process. And I'm sure that many of your inboxes and various things have been blown up from the public wanting to know more. This can be part of our response, but further, it's really part of our ongoing process if we adopt it. So one of the reasons I'm bringing this to you today is we want to be mindful and show people and talk a little bit about what a racial equity toolkit, why would we do this? How can this benefit us? I sense a great authenticity and a desire to be real and not just do lip service. So I would argue that opting a racial equity toolkit in all of our subcommittees and at the committee of a whole will institute in our process an extremely valuable checkpoint and that equity lens, which will help us not make accidental mistakes. I don't see purposeful issues or malfeasance really ever in my brief time with this group, but I do think we could be missing things by not being as purposeful. So that's all I had for you today. Again, I think in your packet, you have the toolkit itself. Just a couple of other quick notes. It is free and available for committees or counties or any level of government. City of Seattle, by the way, is a member of GARE. Whatcom County could consider that. We would get more resources. But what I'm talking about today is free, and it's really more about process. And are we willing to tackle that on and to say to the community, this is really important? And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to either answer them or get the answer if I don't know.
I'm looking for hands. I don't see any. Oh, Dave Bell. Go ahead.
Mike, thank you so much. This has been probably, and maybe some of you have seen this before. This is my first time in having it explained, and thank you so much. I think it's given me a lot of clarity, and certainly is central to my profession and the things that we do in law enforcement. My question, this particular group, who in the community do we engage with? We have this group of people that exists on this committee, but who are we engaging with? How does one find that to be inclusive? How do you go about that? If I want to create a policy in the organization that's going to be about enforcement practices, we have so many different groups in our community. How does one kind of beat it down into a manageable level? Or maybe it's not going to ever be that way. That's just the curiosity that I have on this.
That's an excellent question. You know, part of this process, and Stephen Gockley can jump in because we've chatted a little bit about this, but when you assess who's at the table is kind of a valuable question. It's an easy place to start looking at your committee composition. It can be a way, and are we missing representation from disadvantaged groups? So we might look at, are we racially representative? We might look at buy-in for organizations or, ones that are started by underrepresented or oppressed groups, and maybe directly going to people and bringing them to the table. Other suggestions that I've heard, and I'm no expert, by the way, Chief Dahl, thank you for the question. I'm just giving you some thoughts, might be that we can go to stakeholder groups in different ways too. It may not always be committee membership, may not be effective. It may not be exactly what those groups might need. Could we in some way go to them, maybe through different listening sessions, maybe something a little bit more purposeful where it's semi-annual, we bring a report and then we facilitated dialogue with some of these groups that we are not a part of. I think the question is key, and I think that can take us somewhere. I don't have direct answers on that. As leading the Coalition on Homelessness for years, it was challenging. It was really challenging sometimes to get the representation from folks. We were making policy decisions about people experiencing homelessness, but that onus, we agree to take that onus on us. And not to say, well, we made a seat for you, why didn't you come? We increase the responsibility on ourselves and we find out why. And we found out maybe what different way can we go to you or get this information to you or solicit your input because it's just that valuable. I hope that was in some way an answer. I don't have expert answer. And I think we could look to other communities too who may have answered this question in a better way than we have. But hopefully that's a start.
It is. Thanks for the presentation, Mike. It was good.
Thanks for the question. Jill, are you running? I saw a question from Heather and I see Arlene. So I guess Heather and then Arlene.
Hands raised.
Okay, maybe Arlene.
I like your answer. The specifics of it have to do just simply with outreach and personal relationships. This is what we don't have very much of in our community. That means each of us has got to take a personal step with people we meet, and maybe through the methods that Mike is suggesting are good methods. But when you have an opportunity, you have to reach out and personalize it and meet that person for coffee, get to know them a little bit, discuss these issues with them, and make them pull them into your circle or get into their circle, however way you want to look at it. But I don't see any other way, and I think our larger community has difficulty with this. It's not a criticism, just an observation of what I see. People are in their tight circles. They don't open them up very much. And that's my suggestion.
One of our attendees, Heather Flaherty, has her hand raised.
Thank you so much for allowing me to speak out of turn. And Chief Dahl, I just really wanted to thank you for the question. And I think you and so many other leaders in our community are asking that question. And I just wanted to raise my hand and say that there are a group of people working on establishing a racial equity commission that would be a quasi-governmental entity similar to the DV Commission, that at least could be that table and a mechanism for exactly the kinds of questions you're asking, where we can bring underrepresented voices, marginalized voices together with policymakers and decision makers to work on solutions together, because we really need to do that with each other. And Prosecutor Ritchie, I see you are here too. If you have any more you want to share, I'm going to go back on mute, and just thanks for unmuting me for that moment.
Jackie and then Eric Ritchie.
I know we had some representation from Louis once upon a time on the task force, and I don't know what happened to that. They sort of drifted out, but I just wondered if having these meetings in a remote platform could envelop more people who might otherwise struggle to get to meetings, back and forth. So I don't know if it might be worth extending invitations once again and reaching out to folks again.
It's a really good point. Technology could be something that helps us. I might go to what I've heard from some people much smarter than me in this area, that so much of that is regarding relationships. And this may be true for some of our marginalized communities, or if we want to think of another one, think of farm workers who are fairly to themselves, and they have safety reasons regarding that. It doesn't mean it's not surmountable, but it might need something, an invitation plus, I guess, Jackie. But I think you're right. Technology could be a way to facilitate some of that inclusion.
Right. So, Mike, I have a couple questions. The first one is I'm wondering if this toolkit idea might be better brought through the Racial Equity Commission. Racial Equity Commission is something that is going to happen, as I understand it. SATPOL is planning on funding this for 2021. And, I know that getting something to go very quickly is important, because doing the right thing is, of course, the right thing. But it might make sense to have the people that I think are going to be handling a lot of these issues propose it, and maybe even tweak it to what makes sense for our community. Do you have any thoughts about that?
You bring up an excellent point. I think in terms of an overall meta response, a Racial Equity Commission could look very broadly at all areas of county government and would certainly be a plus. But I might just add this comment that a both and would be good. And the reason why I'm going to say both and is because a lot of work gets created within these subcommittees, within these task forces. And when that work has the framework and the lens, when we finally get something up to that Racial Equity Commission, hey, take a look at this thing. What do y'all think? it should fly because we have baked in, if you will, some of that analysis. We don't have to do it at the same level, the same depth, but one would argue that when you ask these questions in all of your areas, I think you're going to get even better results. But you bring up a really good point. Their ability to go deeper, maybe to leverage additional resources and to bring more expert testimony to that will probably outstrip any given subcommittee. But on the other hand, I would say we still have that onus. I'd like to think that I have that responsibility and that onus to be thinking, be more mindful about things that I propose and what are their consequences. And I think that's what this toolkit and why it's important for the Incarceration Prevention Reduction Task Force to incorporate its work, not to be experts on all things, all in the community racial equity, but to make sure that those reforms and those things we are proposing, we have put through a little bit of a test on our own. So that's just my thought, but you have a good point.
Right. So I wanted to say that I expect that the Racial Equity Commission is going to be bigger than just county government. It's going to be bigger. It's going to be working with the cities, all their cities within Whatcom County, and probably private businesses as well. You know, evaluating how things are working. Maybe even some of the more, think school district, Western Washington University, all sorts of things. They should be looking at everything. So it's going to be much bigger than just county government. The next thing I wanted to say is what you're talking about and presenting something at this point, you have to admit it does presuppose what people of color might think is important in our community. And that concerns me a little bit. I don't want to be involved in that. I don't want to do that. And I think it's important that we get the conversation, get more people involved in the conversation before we vote on a toolkit like that. And the next thing I want to say is I want to ask you what you think about how this toolkit and a Racial Equity Commission could work together. How do you think that might work?
You bring up an excellent point again, which is that who's in the group, right, that would be implementing a racial equity toolkit, right? Are there people that look essentially like you and I do? I think that that's part of the process, is making sure that we do have better representation. Arlene brought up some examples of how that might actually come about, but that's key. But even if you don't, I might just ask us to think that even if maybe we don't have the representation that we think that we absolutely need to be able to do that, that we still ask the question, we still put ourselves to the work. We agree to be humble and occasionally make mistakes and to reach outside when we need better support. How it could interplay, your point about a Racial Equity Commission would be ideal. Maybe we adopt it and we need some assistance in adopting it. And we go to that Racial Equity Commission for some expert witness on how to help us through that. I think that could actually be a really positive synergy, because essentially what we'd be doing, remember, this is like a checkpoint in the process, I think, is a way to describe it. It is just kind of, it's being mindful and being very methodical in our solution generation process to make sure that we've thought about that. So while there is inherent risk that maybe we didn't have the right voices asking those questions, I wonder if it's a bigger risk to not ask them. And I think that's why I'm here today, is because I have come to the decision that it's a bigger risk to not ask the question, even if I think I may not be the most ideal person. But again, I want to echo your really good point that they could operate very well with a Racial Equity Commission in kind of doing that checkpoint, and maybe at the level of steering or something of that nature. I could see some really good synergies in that work.
And I'll just say that you may be right about the way they might work together, and it might be the right move to do this. On the other hand, what we could be doing is taking a position that this is the right thing to do and that we intend to implement it and implement a toolkit, and then wait until we have the DV Commission be part of the decision process. Did I say DV? I meant to say Racial Equity Commission. I've done that a number of times, sorry.
It's all right.
So I kind of like what you just said, Eric, because I've done the implicit bias training. I've now heard Mike Parker's presentation several times, which is excellent. And I really like the SCARE toolkit. And I think it's important that we jump on board with this. But I also just did a presentation that was done through the City of Blaine and the school district called REACH, which is Respecting Ethnic and Cultural Heritage Foundation Training. And this was mandatory training, but it was well received by both the school and city employees. I think we need a toolkit and we need to address these issues. I'd like to see what the Racial Ethnicity Commission is doing. Are they looking at a toolkit? Is it the GARE toolkit? Is there another one? It seems like maybe it's good to have two different ones. Maybe it's best to look at both of them if there is another one out there that somebody else is using. And I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to make sure this presentation was here today, so that everybody had as much knowledge as they needed before they go to the next task force and vote if this is what we want to proceed with, because it's important that we move in the right direction and we move quickly, but we don't leave anything behind.
I see Stephen has their hand up.
Stephen?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Mike. With all due respect, I want to push back a little bit on Eric's point. I'm very much in support of the creation of a Racial Equity Commission. I'm very pleased to hear the informal commitment County Executive Sidhu has made for that. But I think they're entirely different and complementary approaches to racial equity considerations. I think the scope that Eric, you described is in the talking stages for that, means that we're looking at a very high level, policy level kind of operation across the whole community. And what I want to emphasize seems to me most important in what Mike is presenting is a very granular approach, a thought process, a decision-making analysis process that the GARE toolkit would give us in reaching conclusions within the task force and maybe its subcommittees. It pushes us in directions that we've already made some verbal acknowledgement toward: the need for data underlying decision-making, the need for community engagement, and the need for outcome assessments and accountability kinds of measures, none of which we have really incorporated in the task force's work. So to me, it's a way for us to orient our thinking in a very detailed way as we go about our work just within the task force. And I want to remind everybody, the task force is not a decision-making or a program implementing body. It is an advisory body created by the county council. The recommendations that we make go to the county council. The county council may look at our recommendations, may want to run them through the Racial Equity Commission or their own toolkit. So there's nothing that could divert a fuller process by having task force recommendations filtered through this toolkit or another framework for addressing racial equity issues. I certainly think we would want to commit ourselves to cooperation and collaboration with any commission that's created, but I don't think that we should wait for a large and diverse and community-wide body to be created and organize its work before we start addressing those issues in our work.
May I, Raylene? Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I just want to say that I stepped away for a minute and I didn't realize that Mike's presentation was just about the task force. I thought this was going to be a recommendation for the task force. We should say that the task force was going to make for Whatcom County, and and frankly, that's what I was concerned about. I didn't want to, a direction for the entire county from the task force when we didn't have the Racial Equity Commission involved. Now, if this is just for the task force, I'm in. Great.
Okay, that's a very good clarification point. Thank you for bringing that up, and I'll make sure I'm more clear if I ever give the pitch. So just to reiterate, in case anybody else had that question, this is just for the Incarceration Prevention Reduction Task Force. I would be more excited if other organizations take it on. I'm working on my own organization to add that lens, but that is a very important distinction point. It is just for this particular group at this point. This is the group I'm a member of. I also want to comment super briefly on Stephen's point. I'm a member of the Commission Against Domestic Violence. I see some other ones on here, and I know the work in that it is in attending, but it's also what we take out of there and then what we try to push out into the systems that we have influence of or that we're a part of. And so I really think that we adopt this, that commission gets up and going. We will have already taken one of the key steps and will be an advanced partner for that Racial Equity Commission because we will have already internalized a process honoring that very work. But again, the work still, as you know, right, being a member, it pushes out into your own work after the commission. So.
Thank you so much, Mike. I don't see any other hands. Is there anybody else that has any questions on this topic? Seeing none, I think we can proceed to the
I have a question. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I just couldn't quite figure out the mute button, the unmute button in my case. But here's my question. What are we being asked to do here? I mean, frankly, this toolkit, and I've not had the chance to read it carefully and in detail, because this is my first encounter with it, but it seems like a sort of a suggestion for a method of making decisions. That method, I can undo this, yes. That method being one that, that requires decision makers at all levels to consciously think about the potential racial implications for policies that might otherwise seem like they don't have anything to do with race, but it turns out they do. And so it's one of the things we try to do is avoid making assumptions and formalize the question of racial equity as a factor in the decisions we make, not just on questions of racial equity, but on all kinds of questions. In other words, ask the question, is this going to have a racial impact? I'm all for that. And the toolkit looks to me like something that would be quite helpful in all kinds of decision making. So I'm going to read it more carefully and try to adopt its provisions into the decision making that I do in my life, and especially in my work here in the court system. But we're just a committee of the task force. And so if this racial equity toolkit is going to be used in a broader way, something has to happen. Like the task force has to adopt it for starters. If we want it, I mean, we're only a committee of the task force, and I'm willing to commit as an individual. I'm willing to commit our subcommittee if people agree, but I'm not sure what else we can do to help you advance this toolkit. So that's my question.
I know Stephen wants to answer, and just very briefly, one of the things, and I think Raylene brought this up, but it was really important. We brought this up at the committee of the whole, but what became really clear is that some folks at that hadn't been exposed to it yet. And asking people to jump on board with something where they didn't get time like here, where we can ask questions about it and discuss it a little bit, think about how it would be applied in our subcommittees. This was seen as really important and seminal work, so that people would then feel more included, understand, and really be able to authentically say, yes, I want to do this. I just want to bring up comment Mayor Korthais reached out to me after that and said, I would like to see more about this. So I think we have folks who would be willing. We just realized we needed to slow down that process a bit, which is hard for me. I'm really passionate about this. But on the other hand, I think process and making sure that people understand what they're agreeing to and they understand why it could be just so critical for us in our response was important. So I guess this is one of the last subcommittees that didn't get a chance to kind of tackle this, see it, ask questions within their context before taking it back. Steering already voted that it was worth bringing to the committee of the whole. And I think the next step after meeting with you all is we will have kind of done the roadshow, if you will, and been able to expose people to it. I want to stop talking, and Stephen, I see, has a hand.
Stephen and then Dave Dahl.
Yeah, I'll just elaborate briefly on Mike's comment because he accurately summarized where I think we are. And Jill, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but steering committee recommended adoption of this for the task force. It was on the task force agenda, and we postponed it for the kind of deeper reflection that that Mike just described, especially at the request of Mayor Cortes to be able to consult with other small city administrations. But it's coming back on the agenda for the task force. So it does have some vetting in some of the other subcommittees. It has the imprimatur of the steering committee, and it should be back for a decision on adoption for the task force at the next task force meeting. So this is a way for us to understand it a little better, discuss it a little more fully, and reflect on it a little more deeply before we take up that actual question.
Thank you, Stephen. I didn't realize that that it was a work in process with the committee of the whole as well. That's good.
Thank you, Judge Garrett and Stephen Gockley. David Dahl, go ahead.
So to promote a better understanding of this, is it at all possible for us kinesthetic and visual learners to potentially have an example in this presentation of what this looks like in real life? Whether it's how it could be very easily, I'm thinking a simple example of how a policy comes forward. You understand what I'm saying? Is it possible to get an example of this process and the impacts that this toolkit could have on making the right decisions? I'll just throw that out there.
That's a super question. Today, I don't have an actual example, although there are tons. So City of Seattle has been using this method and has incorporated it into all levels of work. And so there are definite examples. If you will, if this could be useful, Chief Dahl, I think hypothetically, one of the things that we might, let's say that we're talking about a stop and frisk policy. And this is one of the classic examples that people have brought up of things that have been proposed by folks, instituted by some peace officers, and wasn't intended to target persons of color. However, in its praxis, in what happened, it obviously had very disproportionate outcomes. When you look at the results of who was stopped and who was frisked and who maybe entered into the criminal justice system as a result of that, it was overwhelmingly persons of color, right? So what the toolkit would do is say that we're going to propose, we have these problems in our streets, and what if we did a stop and frisk? The toolkit then says, okay, well, what is the intention of stop and frisk? Who would it help? Who would it hurt? Kind of forcing us to go through the motions, even though it appears on its surface as maybe a race neutral policy. We're just looking at behavior, right? We're not looking at skin color, we're looking at behavior. It would force us to look at, are there examples of where this has been done elsewhere? What are the potential pitfalls? How much implicit bias training can we actually do to root that out? Or is it maybe just bad on its face? So I'm just kind of hypothetically trying to create a conversation. Maybe the pretrial risk assessment is a better example. And I know we have Judge Garrett on the line here too, but I think that this was a great win, I guess, for this task force. However, there were certain elements of it, and Judge Garrett maybe could correct me if I'm wrong, there were one or two pieces of or questions that actually had a disproportionate impact on folks of color. So the racial equity toolkit would force us to look at this proposal, pretrial risk assessment, go through and look at the evidence and look at the data, and or if it's brand new, can we hypothetically propose, what does it look like in our county? Is that at all helpful? And I can get, by the way, real examples for this group and for the committee of the whole.
Yeah.
From the,
I think that I would move away from stop and frisk because there's some huge limitations in this state. So I don't think it's a great example for. We would never develop a policy for stop and frisk because it's got some limitations on how we can use it in Washington State. I like the assessment tool, or maybe even think about something that we're all dealing with right now, and that is encampment cleanups. You know, we're looking at encampment cleanups and what have we done in a racial equity toolkit to examine that process, or you know, how we're dealing with homeless shelters. Something that's got a local flair that is a work in progress too. I only say this because this is a good topic. It's a great topic, and for many of us, unfortunately, I'll admit, for me, it's a new topic recently that I have great interest in. So finding ways that we could make it real, I think, is what I'm talking about.
And just to follow up, I don't want it to be a situation where you talk about here's the potential racial implications that maybe we didn't see, and then all of the white people who are tied to their particular project speak up and say, no, mine doesn't have any racial implications. That said, I'm not aware of, and I think it would be if it were true, I'm not aware of any decisions being made or any finding that anything in the risk assessment tool that we have been exploring and preparing to use would be using if we weren't in COVID times has negative implications for racial equity. And so I'm certainly, that's a question that we're open to and that we have talked with community groups and advocacy groups about, but and there are many risk assessment tools out there, and they are of varying quality. We looked at a lot of them. I'm not aware of an issue about racial equity in the risk assessment tool that we're using, and I'm concerned because you said it as if that's something that we all know, and it's not something that I know. And so I'm wondering where your information is from.
My apologies, Judge Garrett. I was under the impression that that was that there was a particular question regarding like previous felonies or something like that. So I may be misspeaking, and so my apologies. Yeah, I thought that was something that I heard at a committee of the whole. And so I thought it might be an example for us to talk about, because I know that that question was raised by one of the members. So I may be misspeaking, and I apologize.
No, and you may not be misspeaking. I don't mean to grab the floor, but I'm just going to explain really briefly so that everybody here knows the status of things. We looked at a number of risk assessment tools, and one of the risk assessment tools that we looked at and tried to fine tune, we asked the question about residents. Where do you live? How long have you lived there? And we thought that that was an acceptable question, but research done by other advocacy groups showed that that question has an adverse effect on racial minorities. So we tried to fine tune that questionnaire by not using that question and then validating the results as we went along with our statistician. Ultimately, we abandoned the questionnaire that we were trying to customize, and we went with a different risk assessment tool recently released to the public, the Arnold tool. Now that tool, and all risk assessment tools, they don't ask about housing necessarily, but they all ask about criminal history. And the big issue is how do you treat criminal history when we know that a discriminatory justice system results in minority people having more adverse criminal history than similarly situated privileged people? We know that. But we also know that criminal history is the single biggest indicator of risks for community safety and to a lesser degree, failure to show up for trial. It's the community safety issue that really stumps us, because it far and away, I mean, a risk assessment tool is basically useless if you don't include criminal history. And of course, judges still want to hear criminal history, so you can get criminal history from other sources, like the prosecutor who's arguing the case. And how we treat that is still under discussion. But that's the issue in a nutshell. So we found some problems, but they weren't with the criminal history question, they were with the housing question. However, the criminal history question is a topic of ongoing discussion nationally because of its implications. I think I've explained that pretty well. Stephen, do you agree?
Yes, I do. And I want to say, I want to loop back to Chief Dahl's question and agree that one or two concrete real life examples of the application of the Racial Equity Toolkit would be helpful probably to the task force as a whole. And so Mike, maybe we can work a way for you to do a little more research and add that component of a presentation next time. But I would also say in that regard that, again, this is a decision-making process tool or framework. So I don't think trying to pick a local issue of some high profile that we haven't worked through yet is a good example of how this tool would work. I think it would be better to use examples from someplace else that have been utilizing the toolkit and walk through their process of reaching a policy decision that the toolkit guided them on. That said, I think that probably the pretrial risk assessment is the single local example I'm aware of where this process has at least been roughly tracked. And I give deep kudos to Judge Garrett for her guiding that work group through this process, because I think at every step, if you look at the 6 questions in Mike's presentation, Judge Garrett led us through that. We looked at data, we engaged community voices, we have set up an accountability process and an outcome assessment process where we will look back and make adjustments if we do see unintended consequences arising. So I do think that's an example of how this thought process might work, but I think it would be, since we're not quite done with the pretrial risk assessment process, I think drawing in examples that have worked well from other jurisdictions that have used the toolkit might be a good way to illustrate how it could be applied locally.
That's an excellent point. So Chief Dahl, thank you for the suggestion. I think that's really key. People need to be able to see what would this look like here and how would we do it? And we can definitely get some concrete examples. And Stephen, thank you for clearing that. That's really what I meant essentially, was that process with the pretrial assessment kind of in a way mirrored this. Maybe it didn't have this formal 6-step and go through it, but really that care and that analysis was the kind of thing that would happen, but not just occasionally. We would make it a matter of course and all the time. So duly noted, Chief Dahl's request is really smart, and I accept that charge, and I will bring a couple of examples. I'll try and go local too. I know City of Seattle has some local-ish that we can kind of see how they employed it and what difference did it make for them.
Thank you so much, Mike. I really appreciate the time that you've taken, and this is a very important topic. And obviously, I'm looking at the time, and we're running short, so we're going to miss some of this stuff on our agenda today. But I didn't want to cut this short because of the information and the good discussion we're having. Just on a side note, from that REACH class that I just went to, one example that they provided was when you go to the grocery store and you're not a person of color and you pay with a credit card, they may not ask you for your identification, whereas somebody of color is more likely to be targeted and ask for identification. So policy in a grocery store would be, if you're going to take a credit card, everybody's going to be asked for ID, so that they're not disparaging amongst different groups. That's just throwing it out there as an idea. It's obviously not something that we're looking at in this task force, but just a thought from that class. The next two items that it doesn't look like we're going to have time for is data questions for the index committee. And maybe that can be, if the committee agrees, we can look at that with the behavioral crisis stabilization meeting, which is actually going to be November 10th. It's a joint committee. And then I believe we also were talking about some of the involuntary and the MCO contract requirements, if we can address any issues or if we've gotten any further on that. Is there anybody else that has any other ideas that they want to bring to the next committee, or other comments that need to be made on other topics that we need to do? Arlene?
Yeah, did we decide not to vote on the toolkit?
I believe that was tabled for the full task force.
Okay, tabled, all right.
We're voting there. Am I missing something, Stephen?
That's correct. The question is currently before the full task force.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other comments, questions, needs for the next meetings? Is there any public comment? Seeing and hearing none, I want to thank everybody for their participation today. It was a great discussion, and if you have anything else that you think that our committee needs to address, please let me know so we can get it on the next agenda. Appreciate it. And I think I'm meeting adjourned.